Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second workshop of the ACES conference, Sexually Trafficked Children and Domestic Violence, Shifting the Blame. So before we begin, I wanted to address some housekeeping items just to make sure. Obviously, the workshop will be recorded and will be available for viewing on Whova for the next 3 months. You are welcome to please rename yourself, adding your pronouns so that we know how to refer you as we progress in the workshop. And both Crystal and I from First Five Kern will be your assistants throughout this workshop. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us via the chat and we can assist you at any time. But it is our pleasure to introduce Dr. Angela Look. She is a social worker supervisor with Department of Human Services and psychology professor at Cal State University, Bakersfield. Dr. Look, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm so thankful to be here and share this information that I'm so passionate about. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump in just because I have a lot to go over and I usually train for a lot longer. So I'm going to try to get through everything. I apologize, my voice is a little raspy from my son's baseball game yesterday because I'm not only a professional in this field who has given my life to helping kids, but I'm also a mom of 8 kids. And so that keeps me busy, and I come to my work with that perspective as well, because kids are important, our own and the ones that we're working with. So I apologize for my weird voice though. So we're going to jump in and I will go ahead and put my PowerPoint on. So just so everyone is aware, I supervise a special unit at Child Protective Services that deals with trafficked and exploited youth. So my experiences are mostly going to come from that perspective. However, there's a lot of crossover with domestic violence from a trafficked youth. And so I brought that in as well. And the shifting the blame part of that title is really important because we have to realize as professionals and as people who try to help, sometimes we actually do the contrary because we blame the victims without meaning to, usually, I believe. When we ask questions like, well, why did you go with him? Or why did you go back? We are inadvertently blaming the victim then for what's happened to them. And so I'm hoping through today, we can shift our perspective a little bit and we will no longer be in the place where we blame the victim for what's happened to them. As we get going here, I do want to make note that this can be difficult content. You're going to hear content today about exploited and trafficked children. You're going to hear some quotes from some books that are a little difficult to hear. And so I always preface any training just recognizing that it can be really hard to hear this. It might be triggering to yourself if, given whatever you've come from in your own history. And so I always will be willing to stay after and answer any questions or even debrief with you if needed, because I recognize how difficult this can be. So all that said, at the end of our time, hopefully I can get through all of the information, but I will stay after when other people might move on, if anybody wants to stay around and debrief with me or talk or anything like that. Through the presentation, I do like to have a lot of interaction. And not that I want you to necessarily unmute right in the middle of it, but please feel free to use the chat box. And if I ask a question, feel free to respond to anything that I ask, because if you're engaged in answering questions and involved with the material, you're going to get a lot more out of it. So definitely I appreciate interaction as we go. Okay, so as we start, I do want to give a few kind of definitions that I'm working under, let's just say, so that as we start, we're kind of all starting from the same reference point. So essentially, domestic violence from this standpoint is a relationship where there is power and control, and that is being exerted over another person in that relationship via the use of physical, sexual, emotional, and/or financial abuse. Now, as I hear that definition, because my everyday work and world revolves around trafficking, that makes me think of a trafficker. So there is a lot of trafficking victims who are also domestic violence victims. However, that does not mean that every domestic violence victim is also a trafficking victim. It doesn't necessarily mean that. But that definition very much sounds like a lot that happens for our trafficking victims. My unit is actually called the CSEC unit, CSEC, which stands for Commercially Sexually Exploited Children. It's a relatively synonymous term with human trafficking. And when we work with law enforcement, that's what we say is human trafficking, or HT. So if I say CSEC, or some of the slides say CSEC, just recognize that that is a term that the state has given us as Child Protective Services when we're dealing with children alone. CSEC is the term that we use for that. And what I want you to realize is exploitation and trafficking can be many things in many different ways and look many different ways. And so I'm just going to give a really quick overview of it since we don't have a lot of time. But exploitation can be examples. I'm trying to watch the chat box. Yes, blank slide is fine right now. Exploitation can be many things, such as survival sex for our older emancipating youth, or a homeless youth who have to, or feel like they have to, engage in sexual activity in order to have a roof over their head or food in their stomach. It can be somebody blackmailing somebody for more nude pictures. It can be what's called sugaring, which is a pretty common occurrence at this point with college-age females who are paid to be in relationships with older men. It can be something like OnlyFans, which is a monetized social media platform for sexual content. Exploitation can look like many things. There's also sex trafficking and there's labor trafficking. So just very quickly, what you know about sex trafficking is that it is not the movie Taken. In America, sex trafficking does not generally look like abduction and kidnapping and being forced into sex trafficking. We'll talk a lot more about what it is, but that's what it is not. And if that's what you're looking for, you're going to miss it many times. And we also have labor trafficking here in America that we are not as good at recognizing, but we're getting better. Children who are, taken to another part of the city and forced to sell chocolates door to door until they meet a certain quota, or children from another country who come here and are, forced to pay back a debt for being brought over here, for example. Those are all examples of labor trafficking. So with those definitions kind of in our head of what domestic violence, exploitation, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking can be, we're going to jump in now to a few quotes that I think are very, very powerful. So this is an excerpt from a book that's called Renting Lacey. It's a book that I highly recommend if you want to educate yourself a little bit better about how children get into trafficking and what their experiences are like. It is not necessarily an easy read because it's very hard content, but it's a very powerful book. One of the first human trafficking kind of survivor-led stories, but it was published several years ago, so some of the statistics are not accurate anymore, but the story itself is very, very powerful. So this is called When I Grow Up, from Renting Lacey. When I grow up, oh shoot, sorry, the bar just covered my words. When I grow up, I want to be used by men however they wish. I can't listen. Sorry, my little tab came over the top and now I can't read my slide. They'll burn cigarettes into my skin, jab me any place they like, bloody my nose, blacken my eyes, laugh at my tears, hold a gun to my head, cut me, tattoo me. As their eyes grow large and excited, I'll scream and cry and beg because I can't act anymore. I don't want to be riding a bicycle with a basket in the front. I don't want to be one of those girls with a decorated bedroom and a frilly pillow on my bed. I don't want to giggle and talk about whether a boy likes me or not. I don't want to decide for myself whether to wait for marriage to have sex and remain a virgin. When I grow up, I don't want to attend college, consider joining a sorority, or have my own apartment. I don't want to try different career paths or figure out who I am. I don't wish for a wedding day in a church or on a beach. I don't want to learn how to cook or decide between being a stay-at-home mom or a working mother. I don't want any of those things because when I grow up, I want to be a prostitute. Can anyone believe that? Any thoughts or comments about that quote right there? You can actually unmute if you want. Yes.
Hi,
it's very-
Angela. Hi.
Hi.
I just, hold on, I can start my video. Hi. In all the trainings that I've been to, I can see a young lady who maybe her mother has been in the life and you know, that's what they know, that's what they're used to. And they don't think that they deserve the other things, the things that it's saying I don't want to be. And I also used to counsel boys at a low-level security facility up here in Kern River Valley. And a lot of them want to be the uncles or the cousins or the dads that are in jail and or have, you know, spent time in prison. So I can actually, I mean, not that they want those horrible things to be done to them, but I can see them actually being drawn to it if it's been modeled for them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And we will talk about that as well. And actually I had a survivor who talked about that. Like I didn't even think of any of these other things because this was my life starting so young, especially with familial pimping. It often starts very, very young. But definitely. But why I read this quote for you guys is just to help us change our perspective a little bit, because let's be really honest, especially if you've grown up around this area, we know where the common areas are for prostitution, right? I pass it every day because my office is on Union. We've seen girls and women on the street corners and we drive by, right? Most of us don't stop and talk to them every day. We just kind of keep going, and we've somehow let ourselves either get immune to it or think they want to be there or they've made the choices to do it, and we somehow just keep going. But what I want us to always come back to is this wasn't like what they, you know, as a little girl, what they dreamed of being per se, or what they just decided, you know, I'm just going to go out and let guys do all this stuff to me because that's what they like ultimately desired in life. There was so much that led up to that, and the trauma that went into that, and the modeling perhaps that went into that. We need to make sure we change our perspective so that when we do have these kiddos in front of us, we come from a different perspective when we talk to them, because otherwise we miss it. And that's what I want to make sure that we recognize. Again, that's shifting the blame, right? That comes from shifting our perspective. This, I'm having to change these all around. This is a quote from Rebecca Bender, who is an amazing survivor. We had her here to speak in 2020, I think, right before COVID hit, February of 2020. And she has a couple of amazing books out. She is a very cool person that I'm so thankful that I've been able to meet. But this is what she talked about with how kids get into this life. And she was actually 19 when she got into it. And I'll talk a little bit about her story. But what she said is, in the beginning stages, usually, a trafficker will identify a vulnerable person who seems easy to turn out or not. He will date her or him for weeks or months or even just one date. Each situation is different. It is during this grooming phase that a bond is established. Brainwashing and manipulation are used to then seclude his unknowing victim. Once alone, typically, brute force or coercion and threats are then used to force the girlfriend, now turned victim, into prostitution. Any comments on that one? Let me just add. So what's really important, I think, to realize here, they've actually done some amazing comparative analysis between cult leaders and traffickers and pimps. And they've actually seen some pretty similar characteristics about their charisma and their manipulation, and of course, their lack of regard for whom they're dealing with. But what is important to remember in that is, again, the manipulation, right? And any of us can fall prey to that if we're really honest. Don't ever think, not my kids or not me, or, you know, any of that kind of thinking is so naive and dangerous, to be quite honest, because nobody would have looked at Rebecca Bender and said, she's going to be a trafficking victim. She was 19 years old. She was going to college, came from a decent background. She was a mom And then she met a guy. She met this guy and they had this relationship for a few months. And he said, you know what, I want to move you up to the state where I live. And so he came and moved her and her infant to the state where he lived. She was thinking nothing of it, but she was in love and she went with this guy. And unfortunately, right after they moved there, she left her baby with someone in his family, or so she thought. He drives her to this commercial building and says, you need to go in that building and dance and make back all the money that I just spent to move you here. And so she recounts that in that moment, first of all, she didn't know where her daughter was. If she were to try and leave, she didn't know who had her daughter. And she didn't know where she was or where to even go for help because she was in a new city. She had no idea if she tried to flee from this guy at that moment, where to even go for help. So she was like completely stuck. And so she ends up going into that building and dancing became a lot more. And for the next 8 years, she lived as a high price prostitute, quote unquote, trafficking victim in Las Vegas with her daughter. Her daughter was raised in the home with her trafficker and his many girls until the FBI raided and was able to get her out. Nobody would have just looked at her from the outside and thought, hey, she's an easy, vulnerable victim. But guess what? Through manipulation and through the tactics that traffickers use, she still became a victim. Again, we have to start thinking about our victims in a different way. We have to start realizing they're not to blame for what's happened to them. And then we have to treat them that way when we meet with them. Janet, that's a really interesting question because there are actually a lot of guidelines and books on Amazon. You can buy a book about how to be a pimp. There's tons of documentaries and like TV shows that have been done about how to be a pimp. I've seen many of them. They're quite sickening to me. They will talk about, you know, how you break your girls down so that they'll only love you and they'll do anything for you. One of my recent trainings, there was interesting, detectives had worked with a convicted trafficker and kind of worked out a plea with him that he kind of told them how a trafficker works, essentially. And so he talked about things like, you tell a girl, well, you're already sleeping with this guy and this guy, you may as well get money for it. Something like that. Or again, you break them down so much in their, you know, internal concept of themselves, where they think they're worthless and they're totally dependent on you as the pimp. They'll do anything for you like this. And of course, they're using very derogatory terms about their girls and just speak to them awful. But there are very, very clear guidelines out there about how to be a pimp, if you really want to look into it. I've done some study on it and it's pretty crazy, but I know there was one of it might've been Rebecca Bender actually said, don't buy that off Amazon though, because then they profit more off of it. So there's something to be said for that too. But it is very clear that there is a business plan model of human trafficking. I would definitely say, Susie, that a lot of traffickers would fit into that personality disorder because they have no regard for who they hurt. All they care about is their money. We actually had a girl told, I think it was 2 winters ago, a teenager whose pimp told her, you make my money here in the hotel room where it's warm, or you're going to make it out on the street where it's cold. He didn't care anything about her. All he cared about was getting his money, right? That's what it comes down to for the traffickers, the pimps, the exploiters. That's all it's about. This is one other quote that I like to read. Coming from a social work background, I've been in child welfare for 20 years now, actually. And so I was a social worker for many, many years before I became a supervisor. And this quote always just hurts my heart. But all of us likely here deal with kids who are in foster care or who are in risk of being in foster care. And so this is something really important to know. And what this survivor said, who was unnamed, is being in foster care was the perfect training for commercial sexual exploitation. I was used to being moved without warning, without any say, not knowing where I was going or whether I was allowed to pack my clothes. After years in foster care, I did not think anyone would want to take care of me unless they were paid. So when my pimp expected me to make money to support the family, it made sense to me. That one hurts my heart very, very badly. Any other thoughts or comments, especially if anyone works in that field with foster youth?
Hi, Angela. It's Wendy from Hey.
Hi.
It's nice to see you again and always appreciate your perspective with this. As you know, we hold some mutual clients, and I couldn't agree more that the foster system exactly in that way of being uprooted. And now even as young adults still in the system, they still have a hard time keeping that sense of building that sense of stability. Sometimes they self-sabotage, even if it's work or their housing placement. So we see the struggle that they still have. And then also, of course, the self-worth, which continues to express itself in new ways in their early adulthood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So some of the vulnerabilities that lend a youth more vulnerable for trafficking are also some of those same ones that lend them to be more vulnerable for domestic violence victimization. But before I say that, I wanted us to recognize that Kern County specifically is more vulnerable in a county sense to trafficking than other counties in California. So this is something we as a community must be very cognizant of, because we as a region are especially vulnerable. Do you guys have any thoughts why that might be?
I do.
Rosalia. Go ahead, Wendy.
It's because we are in between two major hubs, if I understand. We have Los Angeles and San Francisco that are major hubs for trafficking. And we're a great stop along the way. And we also have the low poverty levels and high crime rates that go along with it.
So Wendy's already been to my training and she's kind of cheating a little bit, but yes, she touched upon two of the things there. So did Rosalia and Janet in the chat.
I'm gonna mute myself now.
Our location, sadly enough, makes us very vulnerable, as was referenced by Rosalia and Wendy. You know, if you hop on a freeway, you go a couple hours south, you're in a huge hub for trafficking, huge. Like we almost every week hear about a girl who was found in Figueroa or in Long Beach, or they went to a party in LA and they've ended up in trafficking down there in that area. Like it's a huge problem. Few hours north, you're up in the Oakland and Bay Area, which is a huge issue and a huge hub. And even beyond that, let's think if you go a few hours east, where are you then? I think I said the right direction. Yeah, east.
Las Vegas.
Exactly. You're in Las Vegas, which is another huge hub where I said Rebecca Bender was trafficked all those years, right? So sadly, because of our location alone, we are at a huge vulnerability. And as people also mentioned, Janet and Vanessa, the demographic that we have in our county, the low income and high poverty rate, I believe 1 in 3 children in Kern County is being raised in poverty. The high migrant population, the language barriers. We have a lot of demographics that also set our children to be highly vulnerable and at risk for trafficking, unfortunately. So the combination thereof is very, very scary. And I also just want people to realize, again, kind of coming back to that business plan, you know, pimps and traffickers and exploiters, whichever term you want to use for them, they're really intelligent, unfortunately. They really have figured out how to individualize their attack plan against each kid that they get. And I just want you to kind of see how strategic this is. If you are with me and we're at the mall, let's say, the Valley Plaza right there on Ming and Weibel. If you're from Bakersfield, at least hopefully you can picture it in your head. Some of you might not be. But imagine you're in the front parking lot of the Valley Plaza, right in front of, I think it's called Texas Roadhouse. If you guys are with me, I hope. So the mall is a very known place to pick up girls because, you know, there's a lot of teenagers with very little parental supervision. So let's say I find my next girl, I start to make her believe that, you know, we're in this kind of relationship and I'm a great guy and she's going to go party with me. I pick her up. Now, let's say I'm in that front parking lot. I just hop across the freeway to buy some hoe clothes, and that's what they call them. What store am I at if I just go about a quarter of a mile west from the mall? No. Where can I buy hoe clothes that's right next to the mall?
TJ Maxx.
No.
Hustler store.
Hustler. Hustler is like less than a half mile from the mall and is right next to the freeway. Let's just think about those three factors right now. I can get my girl, I can get my victim, jump across, pick up hoe clothes at Hustler of Hollywood, and get on the freeway, and I'll be with my girl and her hoe clothes in a hub before their parents even realize that they're gone. That is not coincidental or accidental. In fact, when I was teaching one of my classes at Cal State, Janet, you just said what I was going to say. One of my students told me, Dr. Look, I am not from Bakersfield and I don't know how Bakersfield is set up, but I'm from Fresno, and Fresno is the exact same. The mall is by a Hustler, is by a freeway. There is a business plan and a strategic model going against our kids, and they find those who are vulnerable in any way, and they use that against them. So we have to know that. We have to realize that. We have to start to be smarter, and we have to know that when we approach these kids, again, that it's not their fault. And it is a little frightening. Let's just be really honest when we start to realize how this is, how real this is. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities. Let's just be, how many of you when you were in, junior high age, let's say, had some low self-esteem or insecurity feelings? I'm gonna raise like both of my hands because like that was a huge problem for me. Huge problem. A lot of us, that was a huge problem. And as what we'll see at the end is that that's the average age, the prime targeted age to get a girl or a boy into trafficking. So that insecurity is such an insidious one to use against a kid because it's just kind of a natural time of life to be insecure. But it starts as simple as this. A girl posts a picture on social media, and they're always feeling ugly. They're not ever feeling quite up to par with everybody else. But an adult man then chats and says, "You're so beautiful. I think you should be a model." And starts kind of feeding into that insecurity and those words that they've always wanted to hear. And now they start to get these feelings for this person and think they're in a relationship. And now when he asks them, "Well, I just need you to go do this or this to help me out," they do it because in their mind, he loves them and they love him, and they're willing to do whatever he needs. Sadly, that's how easy it can start. And social media and the internet is a huge vulnerability for our kids that we know during COVID, everybody was on 24/7, right? And so we know that the risk level for our kids through this time of increased technology and internet use, it just, magnified a problem that was already there, unfortunately. We absolutely know the, younger ages and those who have developmental delays are sadly very vulnerable because they innately trust. And so it's kind of easy to coerce them and have them believe some of the false promises that are often used by these pimps. Aggressive delinquent behavior, alcohol and drug use, that's a big one. Many of our kids have a substance abuse issue as a precursor to this life, but it can also be an outcome of this life because pimps use that to control them, to help them stay up over the night to do their dates, all those kind of things, and also to help numb the trauma that comes from this life. We're here talking about ACEs, and we all already know that a higher ACE score, 4 and above, lends to 12 times as much suicidality. But what I wanted you guys to realize is it's like we have this cyclical relationship with ACEs and human trafficking, because with a higher ACE score, you're more vulnerable to trafficking and victimization. But then once you've been victimized, your ACE score goes up. So it's kind of this, unfortunately, ever repeating cycle that's really, really hard to break, and the impact of which is detrimental. And sometimes, actually causes someone to take their life. Now, definitely, I will always say that any child, any person could become vulnerable to trafficking and or to domestic violence. But we also know that kids with a history of physical abuse are much more prone to be in a domestic violence relationship. And kids specifically with a sexual abuse history are much more prone to trafficking and exploitation. In fact, research shows us that a childhood sexual abuse history makes you 4 times more likely to be victimized by trafficking later on in your life. So I've always tell social workers, if you're looking at a kiddo that you know has a childhood sexual abuse history, you have to right then and there recognize the high risk level that this kiddo is at for future victimization. And if we don't put some interventions in place, sadly, it's very likely that that's going to happen to him or her again. We absolutely know poverty is a big one for both, kids who grow up in poverty, especially if they're a male, and with the culture that's around them and the music industry that glamorizes this life. Being a pimp might sound like a really good idea because the pimps that they see have money and the pimps they see are surrounded by girls. And why wouldn't I want that? For a kid, it can also be the lure that a trafficker uses. We have had multiple referrals come into our unit with the promise of a pair of Jordans, the pair of shoes, a pair of Jordans, as what gets them into trafficking, unfortunately, because their families couldn't afford those shoes. Homelessness is a big one too, because we know exploitation with what we call survival sex is a really big deal for youth and people who are homeless. They end up being exploited for their desperation to survive, and people use that to their benefit to get sexual favors from them. We also know, of course, that high ACE scores, and even more so intergenerational ACE scores. So we have a parent, a mom, let's say, who has a high ACE score. Most often, not always, most often, her kids are going to have high ACE scores. And so we see an intergenerational pattern of high ACE scores, and then that sets them at higher risk levels to be in domestic violence or trafficking. So these are just some of the vulnerabilities and those risk factors that we see for trafficking and domestic violence. But I want to talk about what actually happens. And I know there's things in the chat right now. I'm sorry. I'm trying to make sure I get through the content, and I'll go back into that in a minute. The experiences of what someone actually goes through if they are in this life of trafficking or exploitation. And so then you can see why I said their ACE scores will just compound more and more and more as we go through this. So I got into the whole field of psychology because I had watched a documentary when I was like 10 years old. I can't explain why I watched this documentary as a child, but it was about sexual abuse victims who became perpetrators. And I remember telling myself at 10 that I wanted to help stop that cycle. I was a very weird 10-year-old, like, let's be real. But I also remember recognizing in that moment, since I was 10, which is just a few years ago, I recognized the impact that childhood sexual abuse had, and that even one incident of child sexual abuse can have lifelong impact. And I still believe that. And so then as I entered into this extra world of trafficking and exploitation with that perspective already in my mind, and then I started to realize that for the girls and boys who are in the life or in the game of trafficking, they are generally having 10 or 20 sexual abuse encounters on a nightly basis. 10 or 20 sexual abuse encounters with violence, with degradation, with being told that you're worthless and this is all you're good for and nobody will ever love you again because of what you've done because you're dirty. That kind of repeated sexual abuse and violence and degradation, what do you guys think that does to someone over time? It's a hard thing to answer. I'll be really honest. I know. And I still don't completely have an answer for that. And I've done this work for like 5 years. So it breaks them. Yeah. It does a lot, right? The trauma, of course, is different for each kid. how it presents itself is going to be different for each kid. But it definitely, yes, definitely messes with their self-esteem, makes them feel like they're nothing. It breaks them. Oftentimes they need to numb the pain, causes them to be numb. Yes. It's really quite tragic, to be quite honest. I have like images of different kids in my mind that I think of when I think through trafficking, some of our girls that have been repeatedly trafficked by multiple people in multiple places. And I think of their faces, and I still can't put a verbal answer to that because it's so different for each one of them. But you know, for trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking, there's always this quota. You have to make a certain amount of money because it's always about the money for the trafficker. And you're constantly threatened for not making that, or if you don't make that. And so every day you're living under this threat of, if I don't make the money, I'm going to get beat, or my family is going to get hurt. Or let's just imagine, again, thinking of not blaming the victim. Imagine you're a 13-year-old girl who, you know, thinks this guy loves you, and then he starts telling you to have sex with these adult men, and you don't want to do it. But let's say he tells you, well, you go sleep with him, or else I'm going to get your little sister to do it. In that kind of instance, which is not uncommon, I mean, are we really going to say that they willingly chose to go and have sex with all those men? Or are we recognizing, you know, they're almost like sacrificing themselves for their sister? And those, like I said, those situations do happen. Or the trafficker threatens to go shoot up your family, and you've seen the gun that he has, and you know that he has a history of doing things like that. And so you're afraid all the time for your own safety, but sometimes also for the safety of your family and those people that you love. That's the kind of constant life that they have, constant perpetual sexual abuse, constant violence and threats to violence, no feelings of security or safety. They're often branded. Now, when I hear branding, a certain image comes to my mind. I'm a very visual learner. Any of you like think of something when you hear the word branding? Somebody has to think of something.
Of course, Starbucks, right?
Vicky, cows. That's exactly what I think of. Yes, Patricia. Like I like visualize it in my head. I see the hot. No, somebody told me what it was called and I just forgot it. The iron, the branding iron that they put on the cow, right? And it makes like an emblem of whatever the person is that owns them. And you guys went on right onto it, Diana. And yes, so it is showing property, right? It's showing that this cow belongs to this owner. Now, what do you think it's doing for our girls and boys who get branded in the life of trafficking? It's the exact same thing, right? It is now showing that you as this girl belong to this trafficker. So now I know I'm not even a person anymore. I'm no better than a cow. I'm already been told that I'm awful and I'm worthless and nobody will love me. Now I'm no better than a piece of meat. So just start to let yourself imagine what the internal message starts to become for those girls and those boys, what you start to believe about yourself. And so is it really surprising that when we might come into contact with them, that they're a little challenging, that they don't believe us when we tell them that they're worth more than that, when this has become their conditioned everyday life, that this is what's been told to them over and over and over again. They've had, no safety, stability. They've lost all their identity, especially for trafficking victims. The removing of all of their vital documents is very, very common. Most of our girls have names that they go by on the street versus their legal names. So they always are lying about their name. They're lying about their ages. They might be changing their appearance all the time. They've been trained that law enforcement is the enemy, and really pretty much anybody who's trying to come in and help them, because we're just trying to break up their quote unquote family. And so again, when we come to try and help them, because we think we're amazing, because we are, we're trying to do good, they don't usually see it that way. And it's not because you're not an amazing person, but it's because they've been trained that we're just awful people that absolutely they can't trust us, but that we're going to break up their family, because oftentimes traffickers use kind of a pseudo family type of dynamic that also increases the emotional bond that they have with them, that trauma bond experience, and it makes them less likely to leave and less likely to ever talk against them or testify if they do leave. And traffickers know this, like they recognize they have a really rewarding system going on here with very low risk, because the girls and boys don't very often leave, and very high reward. So why are they going to change? They're not. They're absolutely not. Part of that conditioned response to law enforcement I want us to always be aware of is something about eye contact. So in our American culture, part of respectful communication often includes eye contact, right? Like when I'm looking at Christy or Wendy or Jacqueline, if I'm talking to you, I'm usually going to be looking at you in the eye. But on the streets, you're actually trained not to do that, because it's called reckless eyeballing. If I belong to Pimp A, right, belong, but I look at Pimp B in the eyes, I now belong to Pimp B. And so that is very dangerous, right? Because Pimp A is going to get a little bit mad. So you are trained by Pimp A not to look at anyone, because then you belong to that other pimp. So when we now come into contact with them and they won't look at us, we might take that as a sign of disrespect, or they're just having an attitude, or they're just whatever. And if we come at it with that perspective, we might miss the sign in front of us that they've actually been a trafficking victim. And this is a conditioned response that they've been taught. And let's just be really honest, if we interpret their lack of eye contact as disrespectful and having an attitude, that is very likely going to impact the way we interact with them. And so if we come at them from the perspective of them having attitude, we might have a little more attitude with them, and it ends up being a very ineffective interaction, because we've completely missed what that sign meant. There's also something about forced criminality. And so it might surprise all of you here. Oftentimes traffickers are not the most law-abiding citizens. Shocker. In that meaning, not only are they oftentimes forcing our girls and boys to have sex with a variety of people, but they might also be asking them to do other criminal activities, such as, moving drugs from here to there. They might have them steal the car from their date after the date. They might have them steal his credit cards after the date, things like that. We've actually had girls on our caseload arrested for stealing the car of their John after the date. And it all was really because the trafficker told them to do so. And that's something we're calling forced criminality. And as we're getting more and more aware of trafficking, there's kind of this call out to law enforcement to open their perspective. And if you're arresting a kid for stealing a car, maybe look a little deeper, because it might really be something about trafficking, not just them stealing a car. And there's also very clear lines of intersectionality with sex and labor trafficking. Many labor trafficking victims are also sex trafficking victims, and vice versa, as well as domestic violence. As I said, I would dare say every sex trafficking, or nearly every sex trafficking victim, and probably labor trafficking victim, are also domestic violence victims. The power and control and the ways of using abuse in order to do so is a classic sign of how our traffickers keep our kids performing and making money off of them, unfortunately. So this was from a recent big conference that I went to about human trafficking, and the speaker was a survivor of trafficking, but also now a PhD, and she was an amazing speaker who just touched upon kind of the experiences or the outcomes of the trafficking victim. And I'll just touch upon them really quickly. And I think many of these can also be paralleled for domestic violence victims. So something to just be mindful of when you're interacting with either of those. So of course, I think it's a pretty clear cut that they have attachment issues, right? They have trust issues. They're either like, won't trust anybody, or the first person that comes to them, is their new best friend or their new mommy or daddy or whatever the case is. That they have difficulty with how to appropriately engage in interpersonal relationships. They are hypersensitive to physical contact. So, it's funny because Tom was talking at the very beginning, that first panel discussion about the need for human contact and hugging and things like that. And I completely agree with him. But at the same time, we have to be mindful of what type of victim that we're working with. And if we're dealing with a human trafficking or even possibly domestic violence victim, sometimes physical contact is very scary and they're very sensitive to that because of what they've gone through. So we need to be really mindful and maybe ask permission before we do that, or, you know, something like that. And I've even had that happen with a coworker once, where she was going through something and they'd come to me and talk about it. And I asked her if I could hug her because that's kind of my innate response. And she told me no. And so I had to respect that. So we need to be very mindful that they're very sensitive to physical contact because of their trauma. They often have somatization. So they might, the most common occurrence is kind of stomach issues, stomach pain. Yet they can never be diagnosed with a medical problem, but the pain continues, the issues continue. And that's a very, very common one for kids who have undergone trauma, unfortunately. They have continual problem with affect regulation. They're in this constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. And I really loved her quote in this session. She said, I'm trying to move this out of the way. She said, "I cannot sit still, be quiet, or sit in my own skin, but I don't know why." Because she also talked about they have difficulty communicating what their needs are, and how frustrating then that becomes, right? We also know, and the workers of mine, Jacqueline, that are on here, we know that most of our kids who have gone through trafficking experiences have significant behavioral control issues. They are usually aggressive, oppositional. They probably have multiple mental health diagnoses on their history, poor impulse control, all of these things. And they're usually pretty challenging to deal with. And I think what's hard for a lot of us to understand for both trafficking victims and domestic violence victims is they may very, what we think of as willingly or knowingly, put themselves back into situations where they're re-traumatized. That's all a part of their trauma, though, and the trauma responses that they have. They definitely have difficulty paying attention. Like, so especially I talk to the schools about this. If we have a girl or a boy who's being victimized every night, and then they do come to school, because some of them do, they're probably not going to have the best focus or concentration because they're thinking about tonight. And am I going to be able to make enough money to not get beat? Or what am I going to have to do tonight in order to not get beat? When you're thinking survival, I can't even really think about my math homework. Or, you know, the conversations that we'll often have as social workers with the older foster youth, you know, about their graduation or what they want to do when they get older. Well, when these kids are in that moment of survival, I've had many kids who have said, I'm not even going to be alive when I'm 18, or I'm going to be dead in a ditch before then. And so if this is kind of their thinking, then it makes no sense to talk to them about graduation or college, because they literally do not think they're going to be alive at that point in time. And we just had that told to one of my workers last week. Sadly, for a kid who's in the middle of the life, they don't think that they're going to live very long. And really, statistics show us that they're right, unfortunately. And again, very, very logical responses. Their self-concept, that internal dialogue and message of who they are and what they are, is a very, very skewed. Their self-esteem is very bad. And actually what this survivor said is the mantra that often goes on in their head is, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough, over and over again. Which, if you think about it, what a very sad way to live, to always just feel that you're never good enough. So why some of our challenges that we face with trafficking and domestic violence youth, stages of change. This is one that I preach about all the time. We cannot make anybody change. Lord, I wish we could. And Jacqueline knows exactly what we're talking about here. We wish we could just say, this is what you're going to do. You're going to stop being trafficked. You're not going to go back to your pimp, and you're going to stop using drugs, and you're going to be safe. But it doesn't work like that. Change is not forced to be effective change over time. And so instead, we know from stages of change, if we interact with a victim, domestic violence or trafficking, and they don't see themselves as a victim, and they talk about how their boyfriend loves them and he didn't mean to do this, they're in a place of pre-contemplation. They don't even see the problem, right? And so we can talk and talk and talk. We can give them all the interventions. But if they're at a pre-contemplation stage, unfortunately, all of that we're saying is just kind of hitting a a dead end. And it's awful because in our unit, all we work with are trafficking and exploited youth. And as my staff and I will talk about a lot, the hardest part of our job is watching a 14 or 15-year-old girl leaving us and going right back to their pimp, where we know what's going to happen, but we can't hog tie them. We can't restrain them. We can't keep them from going back. All we can do is be the safe person that they'll reach out to next time. And we pray and hope that there is a next time, because statistics don't always prove that, right? But once they move from pre-contemplation to contemplation, where they start to see not every boyfriend makes their girlfriend sleep with all these guys. Maybe there could be a different way of life. That's when maybe we can really start kind of speaking into that moment, right? And help them get to a place of preparation and then action and then hopefully maintenance. But we do have to realize, just like with substance abuse, the life of domestic violence and trafficking often includes a step of relapse. So we might have them, they might be safe and making really good choices for a while, and then they might relapse. We had a girl that we used some really amazing harm reduction interventions with, and she'd been trafficked in multiple cities by multiple traffickers, substantial substance abuse problem. And we were able to keep her safe and with none of those situations for over 40 days, which was tremendous for her. But she did end up going back. But she still knew who to reach out to when she wanted something or when she needed help. She still called, even to this day, actually. And she's like 22 now. So stages of change. It's a really, I'll say the word frustrating, but that might not be the right word. For those of us who are the helpers, for those of us who try to come in and, help or help create change for these kiddos and adults too, actually. Stages of change is a really hard theory sometimes to live out, because you have to watch them go back to something that you know is not good and not safe. We also know that the trauma bond is so challenging to break, that emotional connection to their abuser, when they think that he loves me and he didn't mean to do it, or whatever the case is. Traffickers and domestic violence abusers use a very similar method, and that trauma bond is very, very strong and can be hard to break. And sometimes we as the helpers want to come in and vilify and just be like, he doesn't love you, you need to leave him. But we have to realize, if we come at it with that kind of a approach, what's going to happen is most likely that victim is going to side with him, and now is going to push her or him further away from us. And so we have to be very mindful again how we approach that victim, because we need to realize that trauma bond is there and is a very real thing. And so instead of vilifying, you work on your relationship with that kid again, and hopefully over time they can come to some realization of what is really going on, and then they know who they can turn to. And of course, just recognizing that the significant trauma that they've undergone and that it impacts everything, how they see the world, how they see people, how they communicate or don't communicate, everything is impacted by that trauma. So why this is important for all of us to know: first of all, domestic violence and human trafficking happen in every part of Kern County, in every zip code in Bakersfield. There is no place and no child who is immune to this problem, unfortunately. Like, we can do our best, of course, and we can try to increase, the resilience of our children or those that we work with, and hopefully that never happens to them. But don't ever let yourself think it could never be mine or in my area or whatever, because I promise you it's happening in your backyard. Like, we have had trafficking referrals in every zip code and in every part of Kern County. And the same thing with domestic violence. So we just need to realize it's everywhere. It's happening in our schools, it's happening everywhere, right? And so that's why, as a community, we all need to be aware of it. We also need to realize it happens to our young kids. The average age is 12 to 14 for females. And actually, research says it's usually younger for males. And if it's familial pimping, which is not uncommon, it's usually younger as well, sometimes down into the single-digit ages. So we need to realize, when we've been focused on getting into the high schools to tell our kids about trafficking and to warn them, we're coming at it way too late. And so any of us working with kids at a younger age, we need to start thinking about how can we proactively try to reduce the risk and the vulnerability for our kids, because the average age of injury is so young. And that this is, I think some people kind of mentioned it, some of the cultural components for trafficking. I'm a big one that'll talk about the music, PIMP by 50 Cent and Snoop Dogg. And Snoop Dogg was our Super Bowl halftime show this year. A known pimp was the one who was up there that America was singing for. I couldn't watch the Super Bowl because I was so angry that they chose a known pimp. Snoop Dogg is a known pimp who will talk about his life as a pimp. If you want to go look it up, go look it up. But that's who we as America thought should be our Super Bowl halftime show. I have real issue with that. We've had a 15-year-old girl who was trafficked by her boyfriend who told one of my workers that Cardi B and Nicki Minaj, they glorify the life of trafficking. We have kids who start to realize the impact that music has, and yet we as adults may actually contribute to the problem by listening to that same music and thinking it's okay. So the culture definitely helps condition our kids for trafficking and for victimization, as well as, of course, modeling and domestic violence for sure as well. We need to realize that sadly, the life expectancy for someone who is being trafficked is only 7 years. Christy, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so I'm a victim advocate and I work for the Women's Center High Desert, and we have an office here in Lake Isabella. And you talked about reports that you'll get for trafficking situations in your area. So like the National Human Trafficking Hotline, they get a call, a tip, and we'll send the information to the local agency to reach out to the family, right? And we had gotten one, this has been a couple of years ago now, but it was a 15-year-old girl in our area that the traffickers were coming from Bakersfield, coming up here to pick her up at night after her parents had gone to sleep, would take her down to Bakersfield to work, and then bring her back home. And
I remember the case you're talking about.
do you?
Yeah.
And I mean, this is a good family. I actually knew the family. And so, good family and very loved. There were just some other, issues going on there. But, and once the family realized what was happening,
we will.
they, they got her the help that she needed and got her out. But it is, you say it's in your own backyard, and it literally is, like,
Yeah.
not just Bakersfield, but even up here in the Kern River Valley.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
And the problem is it's really hard once a kid is entered into that life to get them back out. So it's so much better if we can work proactively and preventatively, because we'll tell you, we have parents who are like, what can we do to get my kid out? And it's really hard because, again, stages of change comes into play, right? And now if this is what they've become normal, it's really hard to get that to change. I know we're almost out of time, so I just want to finish real quick. Some prevalence data. I was working with Elizabeth Ruelas over at the Kern Family Justice Center to try and get domestic violence prevalence rates, but she wasn't able to get back to me, but I can get those through at a later time if needed. But I wanted you to know prevalence rates are really hard because, of course, we don't even come into contact with a large number of our victims, and a large number of our victims don't see themselves as a victim right away. And so trying to get accurate data is hard. But NCMEC data showed in 2020, there were 17,000 reports of child sex trafficking across our country. Minnesota did an amazing study in 2019 across their state, and they sampled their 9th and 11th graders to see who, part of a larger health related study, who of their youth had exchanged sex for anything of value, which is how we often word it, because it doesn't have to be money, it can be a lot of things. And they found 1.4% of their 9th and 11th graders reported that they had exchanged sex. And so I think that statistic is actually low based on my experience. But if we use that same statistic in California, that would be over 24,000 high schoolers that had exchanged sex for something of value. And in Kern County alone, that would be 588 kids who had exchanged sex for something of value. Our data reflects just that I've actually myself taken over the last few years. We've identified over 200 children who have been victimized by exploitation or trafficking. And we've had over 400 referrals that we've gone out to investigate of people in the community who called in their concerns about exploitation or trafficking. So by learning more and by starting to recognize that we should not be blaming these kids, that they are victims and all of that, then we can change our perspective so that we can hopefully better respond when we do see them and hopefully make some changes for our future generations. Okay, I'm sorry, that is my very quick and sudden ending because I know that we are out of time. So I will stay on if anybody wants to talk or anything else. And Christy, my slides are on the Whova app. I don't think I'm saying it right. And my contact information is on the back of that, I believe.
It is. I can actually drop it into the chat. Dr.
Amazing.
Look, thank you so much again. Really the tip of the iceberg of so much that we need to know and understand, and really how we have our discussions with our community about what is happening. A very scary topic, but definitely necessary for all of us to learn. We will go ahead and entertain any questions if you would like at this moment. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and stop the recording. And if anybody would like to have a one-on-one conversation with Dr. Look, she's made herself available to stay on. But I will enter the information about our next workshop and actually the afternoon plenary, and I will include the link and all of that information. But as she mentioned, a copy of her PowerPoint is located in Whova. If you have any questions and are not able to locate it, please reach out to us and we are more than happy to make it available. Go ahead, Janet.
Oh, thank you. I have 24 years of working in the ECE field, early childhood education. This is new to me. This is really new to me. I was just flabbergasted with the information you provided at the beginning of the hour. And so as you were speaking, I can totally see the parallels of those teenagers and the challenges that they have. It parallels when we're dealing with children with challenging behaviors and how we can try to set up that environment as positive as possible for those 3.5 hours that they're here in the classroom with us. But the minute we send them home, if the parents are not going to reinforce what we're doing, it's difficult for us to do what we need to do. But it makes me wonder how the brain, these teenagers, their brain is not finished developing.
Yep.
And as they're engaging in these activities, just that cocktail of hormones that's being produced, making them believe that, oh, this is a feel-good activity, but then the brain begins to think this is a good pattern. It's just fascinating. You have my mind just spinning right now because I was making parallels. I was thinking of brain development and how their brains are not fully developed.